All right, well, thank you, Tina. That was very sweet. All you need to know about what I'm reading tonight is that the people who are in it are escaping from slavery. It's set in Utica, New York, in 1835, and the novel has a young woman who is married to a colonization guy, which means that he's for sending all of the people of African descent to Liberia, and she finds these people in her shed in the back. And so we're in the shed, and the person whose point of view this is a young boy who's been running with his mother. Joe dreamed of the Potomac River, a place that pulled at his imagination. He knew the terrain and where the land climbed up quickly to become a sheer wall of rock near the Great Gorge. He knew the rapids, where the current swung around an elbow of the river. More than once his father, Elimus, had warned him to stay away from the water. Last summer, during an almost unendurable hot spell, Joe had eased his way into the river inch by inch. At first he shivered in the cold, but forged ahead one small step at a time. When he was up to his shoulders, his feet struggled to maintain contact with the rocky bottom. Finally, he held his breath, pinched his nose shut, and submerged himself completely. He opened his eyes and saw fish and eels and floating vegetation. His mind filled with questions that he could ask no one. Afterward, at every opportunity, he left his shirt and his pants on the riverbank and went in. He taught himself how to swim and grew stronger, challenging his new power in the current. In an effort to stay near the bottom, he carried a heavy stone. With his free hand he scattered schools of fish and snatched up terrified crawdads, watching as their tiny claws pinched uselessly. He imagined himself a river god, like the type his friend, the elderly slave Quack, described in stories about Africa. At night, he lay on his pallet, and he practiced holding his breath. He worked in the garbage gang along with other children, pregnant women, and the elderly. But he tried to rise before the morning work horn that woke the rest of the slaves, just so he could spend time savoring the water's buoyant, cooling embrace before the stinking work of the gang began. His papa labored in the Barnwell Plantation's blacksmith shop, where he sweated from dawn till dusk, supplying the plantation with nails, making and repairing farm and garden tools, patching cooking pots, and shodding horses with shoes he specially crafted for each animal. When Joe could, he watched his father, often receiving lessons in the art and craft of ironwork. One hot morning, he spotted the overseer striding toward the shop. "Here comes Mr. Wells," Joe warned. Elimus stopped hammering the barrel strap he was working on and pumped the bellows, which reddened the coal fire and sharply raised the temperature of the room. He winked at Joe and picked up a rag to wipe the sweat off and soot off his neck. Wells stepped in. "Damn, I don't know how you people take this kind of heat." "I don't know neither, Mr. Wells," said Elimus. "I reckon it's in your blood, isn't it?" "If you say so, Mr. Wells." "Now stop your jawing," said Wells. "I need me a collar all chained up and ready by tonight." "That's a mighty big job, Mr. Wells," Elimus said, a look of alarm crossing his face. "It ain't for you, if that's your concern." Wells walked casually over to the pieces of chain that hung on the shop's wall. The tinkle of the links filled the room. "No, sir. Thanks," said Elimus. "But—" Wells swung a yard of chain over his head, slamming it down on the work table and scattering tools and nails. Elimus leaped back, almost stumbling into the fire. Joe screamed. "Didn't I say stop your jawing?" Wells yelled. You want a taste to get you moving?" "No, sir. Sorry, sir," said Elimus, his eyes flashing toward Joe. "I get some to you when they's done. It'll be real fast." Wells walked out. Joe watched his father throw a rod of charcoal iron into the fire so hard that fragments of coal exploded out of the hearth and scattered to the dirt floor. "Go pick them up," Elimus said, shoving a pair of tongs toward Joe. "Fast now, or the shop's going to burn up." In bare feet, Joe moved slowly about, grasping little bits of burning coal and depositing them back in the hearth. Elimus extracted the red-hot iron and began to hammer, each deafening blow vibrating in Joe's head. As the collar began to take shape, Elimus seemed to be growing madder. He produced 2 half-circles that could be joined by 2 locks, but he did not look satisfied. His father pounded and filed the inner surface of the collar, checking it often with his gloved hand. He plunged the collar halves into the water barrel to cool them. "Get over here, boy," he said. "Run your finger along the inside there." Joe passed his hand over the inner face of the collar. "You don't feel no bump?" Joe shook his head. "There ain't no tiny hook that's going to cut nobody, right?" "They's clean," said Joe. Elimus handed him the collar halves and the length of chain. "Go give these to Mr. Wells. Be careful. Don't say nothing but yes, sir, and no, sir. You meet me back at the cabin. We got some work to do." At the cabin, Joe found Elimus staring into a small outdoor cook fire. "I ain't never making no more chains," he said. He took a round branch of maple that Joe had stacked that morning and brought it to the fire. The dry bark quickly sparked into a white-hot flame. He held it over his head. "Show me where you find this here wood," he said. Joe led him to a wind-felled tree. There they selected long logs and walked them through the woods to the edge of the Potomac. We're going to store 'em up so that they don't look like nothing but the river washed down from the Great Falls," Elimus told Joe. "We don't tie nothing together till we're ready." Joe asked, "Ready for what?" But Elimus would not answer. In his dream, Joe sat on the edge of the river, surrounded by darkness. The reflection of bright stars sparkled on the surface of the moving water. Leaves shifted off to his right, and he thought his father had arrived. He tried to speak, to ask, "Is that you?" But his mouth seemed full of river mud. He noticed the warmth of a body nearby and reached out, expecting to feel the coarse linen of his father's shirt, but instead felt a thick, fibrous pelt. Something stuck its muzzle into his ear. The click of a wet mouth thundered in his head, and he felt hot breath across his neck. The animal rose up. It squeezed him between massive forearms. He realized that he was in the clutches of the bear. His legs would not move. His throat was closed. He could make no sound. His elbows shoved at the massive body as it pressed against his person. There was no escape. Suddenly awake, he frantically turned left and right before realizing that he was in the shed. He tried to blink away the dream. Even here, so far from home, he had escaped nothing. Joe thought he might suffocate if he stayed in the shed. Careful to be silent, he slipped out of his hiding place. His mother stirred but did not wake. Streaks of bluish light came in through the slats of the wall. He eased open the iron door latch and pushed out of the shed. The cool breeze blowing off the creek embraced him. Body heat had mostly dried his clothing, with only a few folds still damp. The sun had not yet begun to lighten the sky. Solid and bright, the moon hung over the western horizon. He looked up to orient himself by the dipper, and once again he saw the long white mark in the dipper's cup. Someone told his mother it was a comet, but it looked to him like a tear in the heavens. Maybe it was some kind of spirit coming through. He watched to see if the white streak would grow, allowing long-dead ghosts a chance to pour back into the living world. Before their journey, he had had no idea how big the world was. The distance and the days slipped away from him, outside his understanding. However, certain lessons were seared into his head, deeper than anything he'd ever learned before. Walk, sleep, and eat silent. Obey Mama. Trust no one. Say nothing about where you came from. He could not understand why his father and mother had ever started on this journey. As far as he was concerned, they left warm hay mattresses and traded them in for cold dirt shed floors and damp culverts. And he did not know exactly what had happened to his father. His mother refused to tell him, claiming instead that Elimus will catch up. How could he catch up if they did not wait for him? And he barely had been out of his mother's sight even to do his necessary business. Elimus had told him that he's a man now, and he no longer needed his mama to wash his bottom, but she never left him alone. Another whisper of wind blew off the water, and he shivered. They must have been moving further and further away from the sun. Perhaps that tear in the sky meant that Canada existed behind the curtain of stars, and that they were getting close enough to finally be there. He shoved his hands into his armpits, warming the tips of his fingers. There could be no harm in just looking around the town, he thought. At least I might warm up. I'll get back before Mama wakes. He knew to stay in the shadows and slipped out of the yard, walking to the corner of 2 wide streets. After checking to see that nobody was about, he crossed to the western side of the wide road, so that the shadows of the trees and the buildings hid his progress. The only way to return from whence you came was to know your steps, so he turned and studied the property he had just left. Secure that he would recognize it when he needed to, he kept the moon on his left and walked down the street. He passed a building that smelled of yeasty, spoiled beer. Last year on Christmas Day, Master Arnold had barrels of beer brought out to the slave cabins, and Elimas and the other men had rushed over with cups and bowls to get the frothy ale. His father smelled the same way as the building when he hoisted him up on his back and danced around the blazing bonfire. They were told that every day until New Year's more barrels would appear. Almost everybody drank themselves silly and had stinging headaches the next morning. Quack, a man worn down by life's toil, hissed that it was Master's way of breaking us. "We's happy to get back to work after 8 mornings of beer sickness," he said. Thereafter, Elimas had only had a cup or two, just enough to make me happy, he said. It made Joe happy, too, because from where he sat on his father's back, he towered over the other children. Birds far to the east began to chirp. The noise of morning song moved toward him tree by tree. The first blush of rose appeared in the sky. He heard a series of whistles down the road, so he went to take a look. Ahead of him, there was a wooden bridge that arched over the Erie Canal. He got closer. On the other side, down near the water, he saw 2 mules. One of the animals was being ridden by a boy, bigger than himself, holding a lantern that threw its light on the towpath. A cable stretched behind them to the bow of a long, low freight boat coming from the west. It was loaded with barrels. The mule went under the bridge, and Joe ran to the eastern side and saw them emerge, still plodding along in no particular hurry. Then the lad on the mule straightened on his perch. A second set of mules was coming from the east, they too pulling a vessel. By rights, the ship traveling from the east closest to the towpath had the right of way. The boat coming from the west was supposed to slow, allow the other mule team to step over the tow line, and pull its boat over the sinking cord. But the boy driving the freighter showed no signs of slowing. Canal men on the second boat began whistling to alert the boy. Still he moved on, goosing the mules to speed up. Shouts and curses flew from the second boat, urging him to stop and let them pass. He would not yield. By this time Joe was leaning over the short rail of the bridge and hanging above the canal. He laughed at the battle of nerves between the 2 boy drivers. The boy from the second ship leapt off his mount and ran toward the oncoming mules. He made a grab for the harnesses of the team, but the original boy slashed his whip at his opponent. Stung, the second boy had no choice but to run back, stop his mules, lift his tow line, thereby allowing the interloper to pass under. The men aboard the first boat jeered at their rivals as the 2 ships crossed. Joe hooted and clapped with delight. But suddenly he was grabbed from behind and lifted off his feet. "Got you!" shouted a man. For a moment Joe thought that once again he was caught by the bear, but he turned and saw the slave catcher Hickox, who had been chasing them for all those miles. The man who appeared from nowhere and grabbed his father now held him in a crushing embrace. "Swift, get over here!" yelled Hickox. Joe squirmed in terror, his legs kicking wildly as Hickox dangled him in the air. Just as Swift arrived, Joe's left foot found its target. Hickox buckled and released him. Without a second thought, Joe hurled himself over the bridge's railing and fell into the chilly waters of the canal, hitting the surface flat and hard. The bow of the second boat hit him and dragged him below the water. Some air was knocked out of him, but his time on the mighty Potomac had freed him from fear. The water of the canal, thick with end-of-the-season sludge, flowed past his head. His shoulder scraped against the rough concrete bottom. If he did not work his way higher, he knew he would be crushed. His fingers found purchase between the planks of the boat, and he wrenched himself free. Gripping the tiny spaces between the wood, he held on for a few seconds, the few seconds it took for the ship to pass below the bridge. His lungs burned, and his demanding heart pumped in his chest. Finally he propelled himself to the surface, floated, inhaling deeply. He opened his eyes and saw the looming darkness of a second bridge. Right at its center, he let go of the boat and swam hard to the far side of the canal. He paused, hand on the canal's wall, sucking in life's breath. Across the canal, behind where he hid, running footfalls hurried along the towpath. "Joe, come out, boy, we won't hurt you." He's most likely dead." "Damn it, if he's dead, that's $300 you lost me." Joe ducked beneath the surface of the water. The slave catcher's argument was now muffled. He waited. A third boat passed between him and the towpath. He pushed off from the wall and met it a few yards from the canal's side. Again he allowed himself to be pulled along, this time back in the direction he'd come. When he saw the bridge he had jumped from pass overhead, he kept low. Just then he noticed a new current entering the canal. It must have been some kind of creek. It must have been the same creek that ran behind the shed where his mother still might be sleeping. Shoving off from the third boat, he swam upstream and found himself in the colder water of the creek. After pushing against the flow, he crawled to the shore, exhausted. A few minutes later, a man in a white apron found him. He picked up the soaking wet boy and brought him inside his shop and placed him on a cot near a great domed brick oven common to his trade. That's it.